Tonight we'll see whether the Speaker is really willing to shut down the government, risking our economic recovery, to extract callous political concessions. I hope he makes a responsible decision. I doubt that he will, but I hope he does, and help avert a government shutdown.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, it's no secret that Majority Leader Harry Reid and I disagree on a great many topics. And yet I rise today in praise of Senator Reid. In particular, I wish to praise Senator Reid for agreeing to pass the bill that the House of Representatives passed 12:30 in the morning yesterday that would fund our military. For weeks, President Obama and Senate Democrats have been threatening to hold in jeopardy the paychecks of the men and women of our military if there's a government shutdown. And I commend the Majority Leader for agreeing to pass it, for not objecting, for not standing in the way, and for everyone who thinks that compromise is impossible in Washington, that working together is impossible in Washington. I would point to this as an example. That bill passed the House of Representatives unanimously. It came over to the Senate, and just a few minutes ago we all saw it pass the Senate unanimously. It should be able to be on President Obama's desk for signature by tonight. And, Madam President, that's exactly as it should be. The soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines who risk their lives defending our nation should not have their paychecks held hostage to any potential government shutdown in Washington. So I salute the Majority Leader for doing the right thing. I salute the Senate Democrats for not blocking the paychecks of the men and women in the military, of taking them off the table and saying, regardless of what happens, we're going to pay our troops. That was the right thing to do. Now, I would also note, for those who would like to see a resolution of this impasse, I, for one, don't want to see a government shutdown. And I think it is unfortunate that the Majority Leader seems bound and determined to force a government shutdown. In the course of the past several weeks, we have seen the House of Representatives repeatedly attempt to compromise. My view, and the view of a great many Republicans, is that Obamacare is a disaster, a train wreck, a nightmare. Those last two terms, the term train wreck comes from the Democratic senator who was the lead author of Obamacare. Nightmare is the term that was used by Teamsters President James Hoffa. My view is we should repeal it in its entirety. But I would note that was not my starting position on this debate. It was not the starting position of the House of Representatives. Instead, they started with the position that it should be defunded, which itself represented a compromise. The House of Representatives passed a bill to fund the entirety of the federal government, every bit of it, except for Obamacare and to defund Obamacare. They sent it over to the Senate, and what did the Majority Leader, what did the Senate Democrats do? On a straight party line vote, every Senate Democrat voted no. Absolutely not. We reject it in its entirety. They voted, in effect, to force us into a shutdown. Now, the House of Representatives was not done with that. They came back at 12:30 in the morning, late Saturday night, early Sunday morning, and passed yet another continuing resolution that represented a second compromise, where yet again the House said, we want to fund the government. We don't want to shut down. We want to keep the government going. Instead of defunding, which is what the House preferred, the House instead said, let's delay Obamacare. Let's delay it. President Obama has already delayed it for giant corporations. He's already exempted members of Congress. Both of those actions were contrary to law. The House of Representatives said, let's delay it for ordinary families the same way it's been delayed for big companies. It shouldn't be the case that giant corporations get treated better by the federal government than hardworking American families. Now, Madam President, that was a compromise, and it was a compromise even though the Senate, under Majority Leader Reid, had not compromised at all, had held an absolutist position. 12:30 in the morning, early Sunday morning, the House voted on that. Did the Senate come back yesterday? No, Madam President, we did not. The Majority Leader could have called the Senate back. We should have called the Senate back. We were just 48 hours away from a government shutdown, but apparently the Majority Leader made the decision that it was more important for senators to be home on vacation, home playing golf, home doing anything but being here on the floor of the Senate doing the people's business. So instead, many senators came back today. And we voted just a couple of hours ago, and once again, Majority Leader Reid and every single Senate Democrat voted to shut down the government. Responded to the House's second compromise, not with any discussion, any compromise, any middle ground, but said simply no. The position of the Senate Democrats is absolutely not. Are we going to listen to the millions of young people coming out of schools who are not able to find jobs because of Obamacare? The Majority Leader says no. Are we going to listen to the millions of single moms who are struggling to feed their kids and finding themselves forcibly put into 29 hours a week of work because of Obamacare? The Majority Leader says no. Are we going to listen to millions of recent immigrants who are struggling to provide for their families and facing skyrocketing health insurance premiums? The Majority Leader says no. Are we going to listen to millions of retirees and people with disabilities and spouses who are covered on their spouses' health insurance plans, all of whom are losing or at risk of losing their health insurance? The Majority Leader says no. Instead, the Majority Leader shared to this body that I was, and I wrote this down, the, quote, chief Senate rabble-rouser. Now, Madam President, I'm not entirely sure what that is. I wasn't aware that was an official designation. I would note previously the Majority Leader from the floor of the Senate had described me as a, quote, schoolyard bully. And look, it is entirely the Majority Leader's prerogative if he views the way to carry out his job as engaging in personal insult and ad hominem attack. I, for one, do not intend to reciprocate. I will note that what he seems most dismayed about is in the past 2 weeks, the voices of the American people have begun to be heard in this body. In the past 2 weeks, the voices of millions of Americans losing their health insurance, losing their jobs, being forced into part-time work, millions of Americans who are struggling have begun to be heard. We have begun to make D.C. listen. And that apparently, the voices from our constituents, from the men and women of America, apparently to the Majority Leader constitutes, quote, rabble-rousing. I have a different view of what our responsibility is. I would also note that the Majority Leader just told us moments ago, quote, we've had enough, we're not going to negotiate. Madam President, I find that quite remarkable because to date, it has been the House of Representatives that has been negotiating, that has been compromising, that has been trying to find a way to resolve this so that we can keep the government running and at the same time answer the millions of Americans who have been hurting. And the answer from the Majority Leader over and over again has been no, 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 we will not compromise, we will not talk. And as the Majority Leader said, he hadn't compromised yet, and he doesn't intend even to negotiate. Madam President, that's unfortunate.
Will the Senator yield for a question?
I would be happy to yield to my friend from Texas for a question.
The Senator has described accurately the back and forth between the absolutist position that the Majority Leader has taken that says nothing can change Obamacare because apparently he thinks it's absolutely perfect and we shouldn't change a letter, even though, as you pointed out, a number of Obamacare's biggest advocates are now coming back and saying it's a nightmare. I think you quoted Jimmy Hoffa for one of those. But is the Senator aware that reportedly the House is going to be voting later on today and be changing once again the continuing resolution and sending it back over here? This time the report is that they will vote to delay the individual mandate to make it match, as the Senator pointed out, the employer mandate's already been unilaterally delayed by the President in an act of lawlessness. Unfortunately, it's not an isolated event. And then the bitter language, which will overturn the Office of Personnel Management interpretation, which basically carves out Congress and congressional staff from the law that will apply to everyone else. It strikes me that that is another attempt by the House to enter into some negotiation. Would the Senator care to venture a guess as to what sort of fate that good faith attempt by the House to keep negotiations open, what that will lead to, and whether or not I'd be interested in the Senator's observation about whether he believes, as I do, that Senator Reid is marching toward a government shutdown, and nothing the House does, nothing the House passes will deter him from shutting down the federal government at midnight tonight.
I thank my friend, the senior senator from Texas. I think he is exactly right. Indeed, the conduct of the majority leader, it's been recently reported in the press that the majority leader advised President Obama, do not even engage in conversations or negotiations with congressional leaders. And as the senior senator from Texas observed, the House is repeatedly trying to solve this problem, to keep the government funding, and to do it in a way that responds to the millions of American people who are hurting under Obamacare. And the answer from the majority leader over and over and over again has simply been no, we will not talk, we will not negotiate, we will not compromise, we will not listen to the American people. I'm reminded of the old philosophical question, if a tree falls in the woods and no one is around to hear, does it make a noise? Likewise, if the House endeavors to compromise responsibly and the majority leader and the President refuse to participate at all, can you solve the problem? Ultimately, the only way to solve the problem is for Washington to listen to the people. If Majority Leader Reid insists on forcing a government shutdown, then we may face a government shutdown. I think that is an irresponsible course of action. If the House of Representatives asks tonight, I believe this Senate should come back immediately and pass the continuing resolution, whatever the House passes. I don't know what it will be, but it will be yet another good faith effort to keep the government running and to address the train wreck of a law that is Obamacare, and I very much hope that this body begins to listen to the people. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, you know, we have listened to the people. I recall we had a presidential election. We had two people running in a bad economy. Normally the non-incumbent would win. It was a Republican. He ran on the thing, I will repeal Obamacare if you elect me president. He actually ahead of the polls when he started saying that. Well, we all know what happened. He lost disastrously. Did the American people speak? Yeah, they spoke pretty clearly on that one. Now, the other body has voted, and they have wonderful press conferences. They all get out their press releases. They can talk about how they stand up as they repeal it 40 times, knowing it'll go nowhere. Wouldn't it make a lot more sense if the other body, if their leadership said, look, we lost a presidential election saying we're running it on doing away with Obamacare. The American people shut us down on that. We've become the butt of late-night jokes every time we vote like this. Maybe it'd help if their leadership said, why don't we take 10 Republicans, Democrats, 10 Democrats, you folks go back and tell us how would you join together to make improvements in Obamacare? If you've got some improvements, and bring it back by June, and then we'll vote those specific improvements up or down. We've already shown that 30, 40 repeals and a presidential election shows you're not going to get rid of it. If you've got improvements, do that. That would make some sense, but at the same time say, we'll stop this baloney of never voting on anything because we know that, oh, we can vote a continuing resolution, or we can vote, oh, we want to cut budget off, but never say where it's going to be. Why don't you do this? Then come back, and between now and the end of the year, vote up or down every single appropriations bill. So you have to vote yes or no. Right now, everybody is voting maybe. That is a gutless thing to do. Vote yes or no. Instead, we have a small group of extremists insisting on shutting down the federal government, putting their own political agenda ahead of the rest of the country, throwing people out of work, costing hundreds of billions, even trillions of dollars, making the United States look the laughingstock of the world. Come. If they want to really delay or defund the Affordable Care Act, that could add $30 billion to our national deficit. They'll sit here and talk at $35,000 or $40,000 an hour, on and on, reading children's storybooks. And what does that do? I was in Vermont, and I want to yield to Senator from Illinois and just say, I was in Vermont this weekend. I had Vermont farmers come up to me and say, you know, we have to go and milk every single day. We can't just say, oh, we don't, we're mad at everybody. We're mad at the people in the House Representatives, the Republicans in the House Representatives who blocked the Farm Bill, so we're not going to milk those cows for a few weeks. Come on, they got to go to work every day. And they're saying, why don't they pick up the Farm Bill that we passed? Why don't they put these people back to work?
The senator from Vermont yield for a question through the chair.
Of course.
I'd just say to the senator from Vermont, I just missed him. I was rushing down from my office to ask the junior senator from Texas a question which I have asked him repeatedly. He has come to the floor and spoken at great length about why Obamacare, or the Health Care Reform Act, is unnecessary for Americans. What I've read is that 40 million Americans, as of tomorrow, will be able to shop on these insurance exchanges to buy their health insurance. He's also spoken, as the other senator from Texas did, about members of Congress and their own health insurance. I have asked the junior senator, Senator Cruz from Texas, to tell us about his health insurance. He's told us he's not in the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program. I think since he's addressing the health insurance of millions of Americans, it's not unreasonable for him to disclose publicly what his health insurance is, how much he's paying for it, how much is the employer contribution on his health insurance with the
tax break. How much of a tax break is he getting on it?
It's a reasonable question. I'm prepared to disclose that. I think most members are. So I'd say to the senator from Vermont, shutting down the government to keep the American people, 40 million uninsured people, away from the opportunity under the Affordable Care Act is hardly the kind of work that we want to be part of. I thank him for his leadership on so many issues, and thank him for coming here today in personal witness to the need for good medical care, even for senators.
Thank you. As the senator of Illinois has heard me mention, and with pride, the time I was able to serve in law enforcement as a prosecutor, I was talking to some police officers in Vermont this weekend. They were saying, you know, what happens here? We got the Violence Against Women Act, we got the Community-Oriented Policing Services Office. As the other distinguished senator from Vermont knows, in a small state like ours, this is extremely important. It's one of the reasons we are able to keep our crime rate down. But there's training, and they say, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Well, we're going to be on our own. What's going to happen where the INS does spectacular service for the whole country on passports out of St. Albans, Vermont, and surrounding areas? What's going to happen? We'll close it down. Oh, you've got a dying relative abroad, you need your passport in a hurry? Sorry, we're too busy reading children's nursery rhymes on the Senate floor. Come on. Our constituents elect us to lead, not to play bumper sticker politics. It erodes Americans' confidence in their elected officials. We continue to bring the government to the brink in every debate. There's too much in the country and around the world of tremendous importance that demands our attention. Instead of helping Americans get back to work and stimulating the economy, House Republicans are intent on playing dangerous political games to do nothing but weaken America and harm Americans. When they showed they weren't willing to do anything, do you see the stock market today collapsed, just as it has the last 3 days? How many people seeing their savings for their children to go to college wiped out while they play political games? How many people have seen their retirement wiped out while they play political games? It's wrong. I hope those who set this course will be considered before more damage is done. Congress has a real opportunity to reject the slogans, the politicking, the influence of pressure groups, and show real leadership. It's what we've done in the past. We have to do now. We have to do in the future. Stop this always saying we're voting for slogans. That way you're never held to anything. Let's have the appropriations bills, vote for them or against them. Vote to repair those crumbling bridges or vote against doing it. Vote for that medical research on cancer or vote against it. Right now, they're allowed to go home and say, I'm on your side, whatever side you're on. No. It's damaging our economy. It's destroying our image abroad. It's stopping everything from cancer research, education of our children. And in a little state like mine in Vermont, it is of extreme danger. Madam President, I'm privileged to be the President pro tem of the Senate as the most senior member here. I've seen Republicans and Democrats come together. Democrats are prepared to come together here. Where is the Republican leadership as it been in the past? And, Madam President, I have 2 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. The approval of the majority and minority leader, I ask unanimous consent they've agreed to, and that'd be put in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President, I'd ask consent my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
President,
Senator from Vermont.
I want to concur with much of what my colleague from Vermont has just said. Clearly, in our small state, a government shutdown will be devastating for many thousands of federal employees. If a shutdown continues, it will be devastating for families who have kids in Head Start. If a shutdown continues, it will be devastating for seniors who are on the Meals on Wheels program, for pregnant women and young mothers and their kids who are on the WIC program. This is going to hit Vermont hard, and it's going to hit America hard, and this is something that should not be taking place. You know, Madam President, this debate is not about the Affordable Care Act. That is something that should be debated. I think it can be improved. What this debate is about is blackmail and hostage-taking. What my Republican colleagues, especially the right-wing extremists in the House, are upset about is not so much Obamacare. What they are upset about is they lost the election in November. President Obama won by some 5 million votes. They lost seats. The Republicans lost seats in the Senate. They lost some seats in the House. What they are upset about is they cannot legislatively accomplish what they want through the normal legislative process. What legislation is about is the House passes a bill, Senate passes a bill, they get together, work on something, compromise, President signs it. They don't have the support to do that. So what they have now concluded is that the only way they can go forward is to say, if we don't get our way, if we don't shut down the United States government and kill Obamacare or delay Obamacare, why, that's the only game in town. That's all that we're going to do. We can't do it the normal way. So what they are doing is holding the Congress and the American people hostage, and that is unacceptable. And it is unacceptable not only in terms of the Affordable Care Act. Let us be very clear. If we were to succumb and agree to this type of blackmail, does anybody not believe that 2 weeks from now, when the United States needs to pay its debts, that we will be threatened for the first time in the history of this country? We will be in a situation where we may not be able to pay our debts, which economists tell us could lead not only to a major financial and economic crisis in this country, but it can impact the entire world. So if we say, hey, no problem, we're going to yield to your blackmail now, what do you think happens in 2 weeks? They will be back again. And next year, when we go through this process again, it may not be the Affordable Care Act, it may be Social Security. Many of our right-wing extremist Republicans want to end Social Security. If we go through this process, and submit to this blackmail now, I certainly will not be surprised if a year from now this same group of people says, look, you're not going to have a budget unless we end Social Security or we end Medicare as we know it right now. So submitting and allowing blackmail to take place, I think, is very bad public policy. If Republicans or anybody else wants to have a discussion about how we can improve the Affordable Care Act, and I certainly think that we can. I think it's too complicated in many respects. I think it leaves many people still uninsured. We are the only country in the industrialized world that does not provide health care to all of our people as a right, and Obamacare doesn't do that. So I want to see some improvements. Federal workers, we're going to impact many, many vulnerable people who are dependent on federal programs. There's another point that I would like to make, Madam President, is that we hear from some of our Republican colleagues that the world is about to come to an end because the Affordable Care Act will be implemented. The world's going to come to an end. But it is important to understand that many of these same arguments have been made in the past around the time or shortly after major pieces of legislation were passed, which today are enormously popular. Right now, we have over 50 million people who benefit from Social Security. Social Security is an enormously important and popular program in this country. But let me take you, Madam President, back to April of 1935, when Social Security was just passed. And let me quote what some of, turns out, Republicans had to say about Social Security at that time. On April 19, 1935, Republican Congressman John Tabor said this about Social Security, and I quote, "Never in the history of the world has any measure been brought here so insidiously designed as to prevent business recovery, to enslave workers." To enslave workers was his language, and to prevent any possibility of the employers providing work for the people. Well, you go out and you ask most working people in Hawaii and in Vermont whether Social Security is, quote unquote, enslaving them. I think they would not understand what you were talking about. Because, in fact, since its inception, Social Security has been enormously successful in reducing the poverty rate among seniors. But it's not only Congressman Tabor in 1935. Here's what Republican Congressman James Wadsworth told the American people. He said that Social Security, quote, opens the door and invites the entrance into the political field of a power so vast, so powerful, and to threaten the integrity of our institutions and to pull the pillars of the temple down upon the heads of our descendants. Whoa, end of quote. World is just about coming to an end in 1935 because they passed Social Security. Republican Senator Daniel Hastings in 1935 called Social Security un-American and told the American people that Social Security would, quote, end the progress of a great country and bring its people to the level of the average European, end of quote. Not quite sure what that means, but looks pretty scary. On May 6, 1935, former Republican President Herbert Hoover, former President of the United States, said this about Social Security, and I quote, as a matter of economic security alone, we can find it in our jails. The slaves had it. Our people are not ready to be turned into a national zoo. Our citizens classified, labeled, and directed by a form of self-approved keepers, end of quote. That is a former president of the United States on Social Security. Madam President, it's not widely known, to be honest with you, I didn't know it, but in 1936, the Republicans campaigned to repeal Social Security. That year, the Republican nominee for president, Alf Landon, said that Social Security, quote, is unjust, unworkable, stupidly drafted, and wastefully financed, end quote. He called Social Security, quote, a fraud on the working man and a cruel hoax, and said we must repeal Social Security. The Republican Party is pledged to do this, end of quote. Alf Landon, Republican candidate for president. Well, turned out not quite to be the case. Turned out that Social Security will probably go down in history as maybe the most important and successful program ever passed by the United States Congress, plays an enormous role in keeping seniors out of poverty, helps people with disabilities, helps widows and orphans. It has been enormously successful and enormously popular despite all of these cries about how it was going to destroy our nation. Maybe we should learn something from these prophets of doom. Furthermore, you have a similar situation with regarding Medicare. In a fairly dysfunctional health care system, which we currently have today, where so many people are uninsured, so many people have high copayments, so many people have high deductibles, and yet we end up spending almost twice as much per capita on health care as do the people of other industrialized nations which guarantee health care to all of their people. Congress passed in 1965 Medicare. And Medicare today is a very, very popular program. And today nearly all seniors, about 50 million of them, are receiving guaranteed health care benefits through Medicare. But when Medicare legislation was being debated in 1965, this is what the Republicans, or some of the Republicans in Washington, had to say. Remember, today, Medicare is quite a popular program, generally regarded as a successful health care program for seniors. On April 8, 1965, Republican Congressman Durrett Hall had this to say about Medicare, quote, "We cannot stand idly by now as the nation is urged to embark on an ill-conceived adventure in government medicine, the end of which no one can see and from which the patient is certain to be the ultimate sufferer." Well, I don't know where Mr. Hall is today, but I think if he were to ask the seniors throughout this country whether they are suffering from Medicare or whether they approve of Medicare, I think most of them would say that they approve of Medicare. In terms of the Medicare debate that we had on July 8, 1965, Republican Senator Millward Simpson said this about Medicare, and I quote, "This program could destroy private initiative for our aged to protect themselves with insurance against the cost of illness. Presently, over 60% of our older citizens purchase hospital and medical insurance without government assistance. This private effort would cease if government benefits were given to all older citizens." 1965, Congressman Joel Broyhill wrote, quote, "Medicare would initiate what would ultimately become a federal monopoly in regard to the financing and rendering of health care with respect to our aged, to the detriment of endeavors of the private sector. This would impair the quality of health care, retard the advancement of medical science, and displace private insurance." And in 1961, Ronald Reagan warned that, quote, "Medicare will usher in federal programs that will invade every area of freedom as we have known it in this country. If you don't speak out against Medicare, one of these days you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was like in America when men were free," end of quote, Ronald Reagan. And on it goes. So the point to be made is not that the Affordable Care Act does not have its share of problems. It does. And not that it will take some work to implement it. It will. But what we have heard from Republicans in the past, whenever a major government initiative was introduced, was constant doomsday discussion about how the world would collapse. So let me just conclude by getting back, though, to my major point. And that is, in fact, this debate really is not about the Affordable Care Act. We can argue about the Affordable Care Act. We can change the Affordable Care Act. All of that is certainly legitimate. What this debate is about is whether 20 or 30 members, extreme right-wing members of the House of Representatives, are able to hold our entire government hostage. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers, many of whom are trying to bring up their families, are going to lose their paychecks, lose their jobs. People who are going to be applying for Social Security, they're going to be applying for Medicare, they're going to be applying for veterans benefits, will have that process significantly slowed down, depending on how long this shutdown continues. If it takes place, and I certainly hope it doesn't, it will mean the Head Start centers will be closing and other important programs will not be available to the people who need them. So once again, what this is not a discussion about the Affordable Care Act. What this is whether or not a small number of members of the House are able to use their position to blackmail the American people and the President and the Senate and say that if you do not do what we could not accomplish, what they could not accomplish legislatively, we're going to render terrible harm to our country. And furthermore, Madam President, as you well know, as bad as the government shutdown may be, and I certainly hope that does not take place, what we are looking at in 2 weeks is something that may be even worse. And if some of these guys get their way for the first time in the history of the United States of America, we, the largest economy on earth, may not pay our bills. And that will certainly cause a huge eruption, not only in our country but throughout the world in terms of markets, raising interest rates and doing all kinds of terrible things. But once again, their understanding of government is, well, I guess it's too bad we lost the election for the White House, we lost seats in the Senate, we lost seats in the House. That's all too bad. But we still are going to do what we want to do, regardless of what the election is about. And we cannot allow that to happen, because if we do, it's not going to stop now. It will continue and continue and continue. So my hope is, frankly, that Speaker Boehner do something that he should do. You know, as Speaker, he is not the Speaker of the Republican Party. He is the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. And if he put, I suspect very strongly, that if he put the bill that we passed on the floor of the U.S. House, he would have virtually all Democrats and a number of Republicans voting for it, and a majority would say we are not going to shut down the United States government. So my request to Speaker Boehner is let the people in his body, all of the people, not just Republicans, let them vote on what we passed here. And if he does that, I suspect we will not see a government shutdown, and you'll have some common sense over there. So, Madam President, with that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And in the Senate here, going into a quorum call, the Senate earlier tabled the bill that had been sent over by the House. It would have delayed the health care law and canceled a tax on medical devices. Over on the House side, the Rules Committee met. They just ended their meeting recently. They are trying to get together another bill to send to the Senate. And that one would include also other attachments that the Senate is also expected to reject. The Senate's been saying today they plan on sending any bill that is not clean, no amendments, back to the House. And in the meantime, Politico reports the House is putting together another bill of its own that would essentially all but ensure a shutdown after midnight tonight with those attachments. We are also expecting to hear from President Obama. He was expected to speak about 15 minutes ago. When he does appear to speak, we will bring you that live on our companion network, C-SPAN.
Taylor from Maryland.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, we're just a few hours away, absent some last-minute agreements on the continuing resolution to a government shutdown. This is a manufactured crisis that we are imposing upon our country. And make no mistake about it, Madam President, it will cause harm. People will be hurt by a government shutdown. I am honored to represent the people of Maryland. We have one of the largest numbers of federal workers on a per capita basis of any state in the nation, and I'm proud of the work they do every day, keeping our country safe, doing the important research into incredible life sciences, protecting our food supply, making sure people get their Social Security checks. And the list goes on and on and on. These are men and women who are on the front lines of public service. And at midnight, they'll be asked to do another sacrifice in their public service. These federal workers have gone through a lot. 3 years of a pay freeze, fewer federal workers to do more work, furloughs as a result of sequestration. In other words, they're not getting their full pay today. And now what will happen after midnight? Well, some will be asked to work and not clear whether they'll get a paycheck or when they'll get their paycheck. Others will be furloughed, not knowing if they'll ever get paid for the time that they're off. I must tell you, this is unfair to our federal workers once again. Our federal workers want to show up at work, do their work, and get fair pay for what they do on behalf of their country. That's what each one of us want. And yet, once more, they're going to be the victims of the fight that we see taking place here on Capitol Hill, particularly among our Republican colleagues in the House. This is going to hurt people of this country. Small business owners trying to get an SBA loan, finding out there's no one there to help them process that loan. That person's business can't wait, and yet a government shutdown will jeopardize that person's ability to get badly needed capital for their business. It will affect people who are now entitled to get Medicare benefits or Social Security benefits, or they may have some questions about it, or veterans trying to get their veterans benefits worked out. Those issues will be delayed as a result of a government shutdown. Individuals who depend upon the basic research done by government, which will be slowed down, in some cases stopped, as a result of a government shutdown. People will get hurt as a result of a government shutdown. Now, Madam President, this is going to be wasteful for the taxpayers of this country. It will cost the country valuable resources which should be used to provide services to the people of this country. This is wasteful. It will hurt our economy. Just when someone doesn't get a paycheck, they don't go to the local shops as much as they would otherwise. They don't travel as much. And our whole economy will suffer. Now, from a logical point of view, it's hard to understand why we've reached this point. And let me explain why. This body passed what's known as a continuing resolution. That continuing resolution would keep government open until the middle of November. Now, it did not represent one party or the other's view as to what that level should be. If anything, it represents the Republican view, because the number we picked for continuing government is the number the Republicans thought was the right number. We didn't take the number that was in the Senate-passed budget bill. So we've already made an accommodation in an effort to make sure we don't get into that budget fight as we keep government operating. So now we passed that resolution, known as a clean CR, over to the House. Now, Madam President, we're told, and you listen to the comments of members on both sides of the aisle, it looks like we had the votes to pass that on the House side. And yet the Speaker won't bring it up for a vote. He refuses to do that. You talk about democracy. We passed it here. Looks like the votes are on the other side to pass it. The president's prepared to sign it. And government won't shut down in 7 hours. But there's no indication that the majority will prevail in the House of Representatives. Instead, a minority, extreme views, are saying that we're going to use this shutdown of government to try to advance our extreme agenda. It gets us to what we've seen in other parts of history. This is not much different than some of the tactics that were deployed to try to prevent Medicare from coming into law or Social Security from coming into law. The Republicans in the House who are trying to block Obamacare are saying that they don't want to see this happen. They say they're afraid of what will happen when Obamacare becomes a reality. They're not afraid it will fail. They're afraid it will succeed. President Obama observed, and I happen to agree with him, that the naysayers of Obamacare, the one thing he knows in a few years, when this program is successful, they won't call it Obamacare. Well, I could talk about the merits or I could talk about the process. On the merits of the Affordable Care Act, I am proud that we are at last, the United States, the wealthiest nation in the world, is moving towards universal coverage so that we can at long last say that health care is a right, not a privilege. We're the only industrial nation in the world that has yet to move in that direction. I am proud that we've improved Medicare under the Affordable Care Act. Our seniors are seeing that coverage gap in Medicare prescription drug closed. They're seeing preventive health care services now available without co-payments. And by the way, Madam President, they're also seeing a Medicare trust fund that is solvent, and this future looks much brighter than it did before the Affordable Care Act was passed. For American families, they're happy they can keep their adult children on their insurance policies to age 26, and they're getting value for the dollar. I hear these comments, negative comments about Obamacare. They're talking about how our health care system used to be. Talk to American families who saw every year their coverage erode and their premiums go up before we passed the Affordable Care Act. Under the Affordable Care Act, we say you're going to get value for your dollar. The insurance company has to return at least 80 to 85% of your premium dollar in benefits. If not, you get a rebate. Millions of Americans have seen rebates in insurance policies because the insurance company charged too much. They got the money back. They're getting value for their dollar. For affordability, the people who will start to be able to enter the exchanges starting tomorrow, Madam President, tomorrow they can enroll in the exchanges. 3 out of every 4 who are eligible to enroll in the exchanges will be entitled to some help. This is affordable coverage, and it's good coverage. No lifetime caps, no pre-existing conditions. You're getting solid insurance coverage for an affordable rate. That's what the Affordable Care Act is all about for small businesses, and I've heard a lot about small businesses. If you have under 50 employees, there's no new mandates, and at last you're able to get competitive products, insurance plans, a little bit of variety. You can pick the plan that's best for you rather than being told by an insurance company this is all you can get. And you're in a much larger pools. So you don't have to worry about one of your employees getting sick and all of a sudden your premiums go up. That's the current situation that we're changing. So I could talk about the merits of what they're trying to do. But that's not where we're at. This is a process issue. There's a time and a place to talk about how we can improve our health care system in this country. But in a few hours, we're talking about whether government's going to stay open or not. Now, Madam President, I could make a very strong argument that the reason we don't have a budget that starts October 1 is because of the obstructionist policies of the Republicans, particularly in the House. We've tried to go to conference. We passed our budget. They said we couldn't. We did. We passed a budget in the Senate. The House passed a budget. They were different. So would you think you go to conference? Republicans refused to go to conference. So now they refuse to go to conference. They refuse to negotiate a budget agreement. We're now up to October 1, and they won't agree to keep government open. I would acknowledge it's not the majority, but there is an extreme element, particularly on the other side, who want to shut government shut down. They want to see government closed. And that's what we're confronting here, which is terribly irresponsible. It's affecting families. It's affecting our economy. The New York Times, I think, got this right, and I don't normally quote from the papers, when it said the Republican Party has spent 30 years careering ever more deeply into ideological extremism. But one of the novel developments of the Obama years is it embrace of procedural extremism. The Republican fringe has evolved from being politically shrewd proponents of radical policy changes to a gang of saboteurs who would rather stop government from functioning at all. That's what we're up against. I think most members in this body know that I believe in pragmatism. I believe that we need to work together. I believe Democrats and Republicans need to come together and forge agreements to move the process forward. That's what I think the framers of our Constitution envisioned, sitting around a table working out our differences. We've had divided government before. It's not new. We've gotten through those days. We've gotten through those days by listening to each other and sitting around a table and working out our problems. But there are three things that are happening right now that need to end. One, we've got to keep government open. Second, we've got to pay our bills and not be threatened in 2 weeks with the inability to pay our bills. Three, we've got to get rid of these across-the-board senseless, mindless cuts known as sequestration. We've got to get rid of those three things. And yes, we do need a budget. And that budget will not be what the Democrats want or what the Republicans want. It's got to be negotiated. And it will contain, I hope, the best of what both parties can offer in dealing with the future needs of our country. That's what we should do. Put America first. And if we do that, we will help the people of our country. So, Madam President, I know that we are just a few hours away from the shutdown of government. I still hold out hope that we will put the country's business first and stop playing this extremism politics of trying to say it's my way or no way. Let's keep government open. Let's pay our bills. Let's get rid of sequestration. And then let's negotiate a budget that allows this country to grow, that unleashes the potential so that all Americans can enjoy the opportunity of this great land. With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Madam President.
The senator from Virginia.
Madam President, I rise tonight with the pending question of whether...
Senator, we're in a quorum call.
If I could ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise tonight with the question of whether the House will allow government to continue or shut down, to actually talk for a few minutes about a simple concept, but that is apparently difficult in this body, and that is compromise. I want to talk for a few minutes about compromise. Based on the action that was taken by the Senate earlier today, the House has an opportunity to accept a compromise that the Senate has put before them. The CR bill that the House drafted contained a budget number that was their number, not ours. We weren't wild about it, but we've accepted it. And the question is, will the House accept yes for an answer? Over the weekend, I was traveling in Virginia, especially yesterday, at events in Central Virginia, big festivals, and the weather was great, so people were outside gathering. And as I traveled, I heard again and again, don't shut down government. And can't you find a compromise? People are aware, Madam President, in Virginia and in Hawaii, I know they feel the same, that there can be severe consequences to a shutdown, just a few. And I know that the senator from Maryland may have already offered a number of these thoughts, but a great agency like NASA that funds science and research will see furloughs of 97% of its employees. The Commerce Department, which is about commerce, about business, about our economy, will see furloughs of 87% of employees. The National Institutes of Health, dealing with research and other important health matters, will see furloughs of 73% of their employees. And even an agency like Treasury, just a core Treasury function separate from the IRS, they will see a reduction of their staff of 50% at a time when we need the nation's fiscal system to be strong. And so the consequences of shutdown are severe, and that's why the citizens of Virginia are saying don't shut the government down, find compromise. It's not just employees either. That's significant enough. It's tens of thousands of employees in Virginia. It's also services that people rely on. And just to pick one as an example, the number of VA employees who will be furloughed is actually, as a percentage, it's fairly small. But the people at the VA who are going to be furloughed are the folks who work for the VA Benefits Administration. That is the organization within the VA that processes veterans' benefits claims. So if you're a veteran and you've come home from Iraq or Afghanistan, you've been part of a war that has now lasted 12 or 13 years, you want to file to get your veterans' benefits, something you're entitled to because you fought for the nation. And we've had all kinds of stories, Madam President, about the backlog in veterans' claims. You're going to be delayed even more because of this furlough. It's just unfair to do this to our veterans. It's unfair to do this across government. Madam President, I said I wanted to talk about compromise because I think this is not even fundamentally a battle about the budget. It's not a battle about the Affordable Care Act. It's a battle about whether compromise is a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know if any of you had a chance to read this. There was a wonderful article in the Washington Post, an opinion article, last Friday, the 27th, that was authored by a columnist for the Post, Michael Gerson. Michael is the former speechwriter for President Bush 43, George W. Bush. And he worked in the Bush administration and wrote an excellent piece that was published, and I just want to read a bit of it. The title of the piece was "A Compromised Reputation Among the GOP," and again, it ran in the Washington Post last Friday. Read a couple of quotes. "The real target," not the ACA, not budget, "the real target is the idea of compromise itself, along with all who deal, settle, or blink. In the middle of this unfolding Republican debate comes a timely national affairs article by Jonathan Rauch. It's entitled Rescuing Compromise, but it might have well been called James Madison for Dummies. Rauch argues that Madison, I got a mention of Virginian in my speech, that Madison had two purposes in mind as he designed the Constitution. The first was to set faction against faction as a brake on change and ambition, a role that Tea Party leaders have fully embraced. Madison's second purpose, however, was to build constant adjustment into the system itself by requiring constant negotiation among shifting constellations of actors. Following the Articles of Confederation, America's founders wanted a more energetic government. but they made action contingent upon bargaining among the branches of government and within them. Compromise, then, to quote, "Compromise, then, is not a necessary evil," argues Roche. "It is a positive good, a balanced wheel that keeps government moving forward instead of toppling." Compromise, of course, can have good or bad outcomes, but an ideological opposition to the idea of compromise removes an essential element in the cog of machinery of constitutional order. At the end of the day, says Roche, the Madisonian framework asks not that participants like compromising, but that they do it, and above all, that they recognize the legitimacy of a system that makes them do it. Finally, from the Gerson article, it is a revealing irony that the harshest critics of compromise should call themselves constitutional conservatives. The Constitution itself resulted from an extraordinary series of compromises, and it created the system of government that presupposes the same spirit. Compromise, says Roche, is the most essential principle of our constitutional system. Those who hammer out painful deals perform the hardest and often highest work of politics. They deserve, in general, respect for their willingness to compromise, not condemnation for treachery. That's what this debate is about. Is compromise good or is it bad? We have to be willing to compromise. Now, Madam President, as you know, let me talk about what the Senate has been doing to advance the spirit of compromise. On the 23rd of March in this body, after a very late night at 5 a.m. in the morning, the Senate passed the first Senate budget that we've passed in 4 years. And that same week, the House passed a budget as well. Now, Madam President, we've talked about this often, that once that happens and the two budgets are passed, that you have a budget conference to sit down and try to find compromise between these two different documents. These budgets passed now more than 6 months ago, but there has been no budget conference. There has been no effort to find compromise. Why not? Because the Republican, a tiny handful in the Senate, and the majority in the House do not want to compromise. Senate Democrats have made a motion 18 times since March 23rd to begin a budget conference, and in every one of those instances, a handful of Republicans, and I use that word handful, that is quoting from one of the senators, the senator from Utah, who objected to a budget compromise and said, a handful of us object. A handful of the Republican members of this body, working together with House colleagues, have decided they do not want to put in motion the process for dialogue and compromise. The Senate Democrats were, are, and will be ready to sit down at a budget conference table to negotiate, listen, and compromise to find a budget going forward. We've tried 18 times. We'll try it a 19th time. We'll try it a 20th time. We will keep working to compromise. But, Madam President, we've also compromised in the very matter of the bill that is pending before the body today. As you know, the continuing resolution bill was sent from the House over to the Senate last week. That's the way these bills start. They originate in the House. And the bill had two components. The first was defund Obamacare, and the second was, and then we will fund government. Now, Madam President, the House bill said they would defund government, they would fund government at their proposed budgetary number, which is $986 billion in discretionary spending. Madam President, that was their number. That was not our number. We had extensive discussions among senators about what we thought of their proposal. And frankly, we thought the $986 billion number was too low. It includes all the sequester cuts that we disagree with. We think the right number to the budget compromise should be $1,050 billion, not $986 billion. So the Senate has a different idea about the number. But guess what? The Senate was willing to accept the House's number. We accepted the House's budget number out of the spirit of compromise. And we stripped away the Defund the Affordable Care Act provision and said, let's put that into a budget negotiation. In a budget negotiation, we can talk about that. We can talk about anything else you want, but we won't tie it up with the threat of a government shutdown. So we sent the budget bill back to the House at their budget number. And we said to them, can't you take yes for an answer? You have proposed funding at $986 billion. We do not agree with that number, but for purposes of the short-term CR, we will agree out of a spirit of compromise. Can you take yes for an answer? And, Madam President, you know the answer. They wouldn't take yes for an answer. So they brought it back and they added on new provisions, the repeal of a tax that would increase the deficit, and a delay in Affordable Care Act provisions that would provide maternity service to expecting mothers, that would protect adults from not getting insurance on the grounds of pre-existing conditions, that would give a significant tax credit to small businesses to help them pay for insurance. They wanted to delay all those provisions. Well, Madam President, we've taken action again today. We have again made this bill what we call a clean spending bill. We've taken out anything other than what this bill is supposed to be. At what level should government be funded? And we've gone back to the House and we've said, we're accepting your proposal. We're accepting your number, even though we have a different number that we want to argue for. And we'll save the other arguments for a budget conference if you will finally go to the table with us. And so, Madam President, I just want to conclude and say that James Madison was right, and not because he was a Virginian. He was just right to recognize that compromise is the essential element of our system. Think about it for a minute. If you set up a government, you have 3 different branches. The legislative branch has 2 parties, 2 houses. You have to find compromise between the 2 houses to move forward. The Supreme Court and the judiciary, they have 9 justices. They have to work together and find at least a compromise by a majority, a consensus by a majority on any case. Even the president's powers, which are unilateral and would seem like, well, that's not a compromise branch because we put the executive powers in the president's hand. How do we choose the president? We choose the president through the fundamental constitutional compromise of the Electoral College. So the choice of a president is based on compromise. The entire constitutional system we have requires compromise. The Senate was willing to compromise and go to a budget resolution. We've been blocked by the House. The Senate was willing to compromise and accept the House's budget number, and they haven't been willing to say yes even to their own budget number. We stand here tonight at 5:27 ready to compromise. We'll be here the next hour ready to compromise. We will be ready to compromise and find a deal to keep this government open every minute, every second from now until we get this right. But we do feel very strongly, one last thing, Madam President, no one should threaten to shut down the government of the United States. If a foreign enemy threatened to shut us down, we would unify, as we have so many times, to repel that threat. But we're allowing elected members of Congress to threaten to shut down this body, the government of the greatest nation on earth. It is unfathomable to me, and the only way I can understand it is in exactly the terms that Michael Gerson indicated last Friday in the Washington Post. This is not fundamentally a debate about the Affordable Care Act. It's not fundamentally a debate about the budget. It is fundamentally an attack by some upon the very notion of compromise that is at the core of our system of constitutional government. Madam, I stand on behalf of Virginians, and I don't think Virginians are different than Americans in saying we have to be willing to compromise to find the common good. And it is my hope that the House, when they act tonight, will act in the spirit of compromise and the common good and allow this government to remain open. Thank you, Madam President. I yield back the floor. And noting the absence of a quorum,
The clerk will call the roll.